Hello, my AP US history friends. Nice to see you again. This is a recap video for class on Thursday, March 30th. So I know most of my first period class was there. I think almost everybody except for one person, but like half of my second period class is out for the play. So this is mostly for them. Quite a good class. We had a lot of interesting topics, and I'll hopefully get through them quickly for you. You're going to need the Eisenhower and Kennedy slides that I posted up today. That's what you're going to be focusing on as we move forward here. Taking a look at Eisenhower and Kennedy on the first slide, we can see that they have a massive age gap between the two. Kennedy, when we get into him a little bit more, the reason why I think people are obsessed with him more than, good looks and a wealthy family is he represents this transition in America from elderly to youth, from the previous generation to the new. And you can really see that in that picture there of them meeting at the White House. But anyways, before Dwight Eisenhower takes over as president, the U.S. fights a proxy war in Korea. A proxy war, again, is a war between two countries fought through another country. So it's a war between communism and capitalism, but it takes place on the Korean Peninsula, with the North Korean side being supported by Communist China and the Soviet Union, and the South Korean side being supported by the United Nations, led by the United States. Interesting little story here. I don't know if you know how the UN works, but basically there are 5 major countries that run the UN. If any one of these 5 countries says no to a UN action, it doesn't happen. It's called the veto power. So those 5 countries are the US, France, the UK, Russia, and China. So you might be asking yourself, Mr. Williams, how did the UN pull off a resolution to fight a war in Korea if Russia could have vetoed it or China could have vetoed it? Well, Russia was protesting the UN at this point. Basically, I'm not sure if you know this or not, but there are 2 Chinas. There's mainland China that you think about with 1.2 billion people and the world's largest economy. And there's Taiwan, which is an island just outside of China. Basically, China fought a civil war to become communist, with the communists winning and taking over mainland China, and the democratic capitalist Chinese are forced to Taiwan, the island of Taiwan. Basically, the U.S. and all the other capitalist countries refused to recognize mainland China as the real China and recognize the little island of Taiwan just off of it. This very much annoys the Russians, who sit out the UN veto meeting, the Korean action meeting. So anyways, it passes, and the Russians haven't missed a vote since. Shocker if they weren't there to veto it. Anyways, the Korean War only lasts about 2 years or so. It ends in a stalemate. Again, it's an example of containment and the Truman Doctrine for the U.S. It also sets a precedent because we refuse to use nuclear wars in Korea. This was the first war after World War II. So basically, even though we used a nuke in World War II, we don't want to set the precedent that we're the country that nukes other countries first. So we are only going to launch nuclear weapons if they are launched at us first. That becomes U.S. policy. Anyways, one of the head generals, who was also a general in World War II, Douglas MacArthur, wanted to nuke North Korea when China entered the war, and Harry Truman wouldn't let him, so he fired him. So it sets that precedent. Anyways, you can see on the next slide 3, that North Korea and South Korea are also a great comparison of capitalism and communist dictatorships. You can look at the light map and see how much more technology and freedom there is in South Korea, and you can also see how much of a wealthier country South Korea is compared to North Korea. Back home in the U.S., we see different booms. The first one is a baby boom. It's a population boom. Baby boomers are born from about 1945 to about 1960. They are the largest generational group in America still today, and they're aging right now. Old people are expensive to take care of with Social Security and Medicare, so we spend a ton of money on those. It's a government. But yeah, that generation is aging into retirement and even older. It again costs the U.S. government a lot of money today, to the point where we spend about 40% of the U.S. budget on just Social Security and Medicare for the elderly. Anyways, the other major booms we have is a middle class boom. The average wealth of the Americans increases dramatically, as you can see in that chart down there in blue, where you actually have a middle class established. A lot of people also move out of cities. Your middle class and your wealthy move out of the cities, and they move to suburbia, also known as Levitt towns. Levittown, New York being, one of the early examples of a suburb. But anyways, they are towns outside of major cities that, again, mostly have middle and upper class people living in them. It's sort of forced segregation because the only people that could afford to live in these towns end up being mostly white, which is where you end up with suburbs of New York City like Darien and Greenwich and New Canaan and Westport with about 98% white populations but really high socioeconomic statuses. That's where you usually get those. Anyways, those are very important to note down. We have to know about the baby boom. We have to know about suburbia. We have to know about the Korean War. Introducing new president of the United States, Dwight David Eisenhower, also known as Ike. Ike is going to take advantage of a modern invention, the television, to air campaign ads to increase his popularity. He's sort of the first free agent as a president. He wasn't a Republican or a Democrat before this election. He decided to go with the Republicans, and he dominates in the election of 1952, overwhelmingly winning the presidency. He comes across as a strong and wise leader in a time that we need one. Two major things with Eisenhower, well, really three when we get into the civil rights movement, but two for now. Eisenhower passes the National Highway Act, which establishes highways in the U.S. He does this by arguing that this is necessary for defense. If the U.S. gets nuked, we need evacuation routes, right? If there ends up being an invasion of the United States, we need an effective way to move about the country. 1 out of every 10 miles on every U.S. national highway is flat and straight, and that is so they can be used as runways for airplanes in case we need to. They're emergency landing and takeoff areas. He also warns against something called the military-industrial complex. There's a video there that gets his speech. There's also a video on the previous slide of his campaign ad if you want to watch. But anyways, the military-industrial complex gets a star, exclamation point. It gets asked about all the time. It is basically this idea that the U.S. government should not be using taxpayer money to create industries. That's a bad idea. Obviously, people that make weapons for the military, their only customer is the U.S. Army and the U.S. military. He also warned against that creating such a large military. It is a necessity at this point, It's necessary for us to do this, for us to be safe, especially in the Cold War. But there are downsides to it, and that's what he's warning against. That it's a threat to democracy. If you have such a powerful army and navy, the people, are basically powerless against the army if there had that situation been arise. So he warns against the military-industrial complex, which, we still spend about $700 billion a year on a military today. So take with that what you will. But Ike was worrying about it nice and early. We also see in the 1950s, because of the fact that the television is now in like 98% of households by 1960, the rise of mass culture. Again, there's a video to Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show back then. There's only 3 TV channels, and people are wrapped into mass culture. It's not like today where there are shows on Hulu and Amazon Prime and Netflix and HBO Max. There are really only 3 television channels airing very similar things. So Elvis being on the Ed Sullivan Show is watched by like more than half of the country. I always hate it when people come up to you today and say, "Oh, have you seen the show?" And you go, "No." They're like, "How have you not seen that show?" Well, there's 10 million options. It's not like it's 1955 and it's like, "Oh, did you see Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show?" Yeah, what else was I watching? You know what I mean? So anyways, mass culture does rise up. The blue jean, leather jackets, Elvis Presley rock and roll records, the car culture, all that stuff you think of from the movie Grease is really what comes to rise at that point. But when there's culture, there's counterculture. We do have resistance to these movements, people that think that being cool isn't cool or what people think is cool isn't cool. So anyways, there are 2 major counterculture movements. One are the beatnik generation. They're a group of Americans that sort of shy away from mass culture, that don't find happiness in celebrity or TV culture. And they sort of wander around the country writing books, listening to music, writing poems, trying to figure out what the whole meaning of life is. If you click on the Beatnik link there, it's a link to one of my favorite excerpts from any book in history, On the Road by Jack Kerouac. It's a great example of what the Beatniks were writing about, this sort of what should we be doing with our lives? Should we be taking risks? Should we be having experiences? Their answer to that is yes. Again, you also have the hippie culture that is cited as a counterculture. There's a lot to dive in there too, but the APUS exam will pretty much only ask you about them as in terms of a counterculture movement. So we'll come back to Eisenhower and the civil rights movement. We'll also come back to Kennedy and the civil rights movement. Kennedy takes office in 1960. He runs a very close campaign with Richard Nixon. vice president for Eisenhower. Essentially, Kennedy wins by taking advantage of television. He's quite a handsome man. He's got a young family. He's very good at speaking to the public. He's very good at talking into the camera. So very famously in 1960, there's a presidential debate between Kennedy and Nixon. People that listened to it on the radio overwhelmingly thought Nixon won. People who watched it on television overwhelmingly thought Kennedy won, showing the power of television and how public image is going to become a major factor, especially in politics. Politicians are a product. They need to be sold, is a great quote from the show Mad Men when they talk about this. Anyways, JFK is the youngest president ever elected. Again, he really represents this sort of youth culture in America. Second period, you didn't get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. We'll cover that in class next. First period did, so I'm going to skip that because pretty much everybody was there. If you were absent first period and need the Cuban Missile Crisis, let me know. Second period did not get there. But anyways, that's where we'll pick up in our next class, and the assassination of JFK. Thank you. Have a great day. Let me know if you have any questions.